Welcome to RI Realtors Fair Housing Forum, Breaking Bad, Barriers to Housing. To start our program, I'd like to introduce Monica Staff, our wonderful general counsel, who has agreed to be our moderator today, and she is going to introduce all of our panelists. Monica, thank you.
Thank you, Bev, and good morning, everyone, and welcome. We really appreciate our panelists taking the time to be with us this morning to talk about these important topics. Our first panelist, Susan Martin Phipps, who many of you may already know. Susan is the Chief Appraiser of Phipps Real Estate Services. She's also a member of the National Association of Realtors Property Valuation Committee. So she's going to be talking to us a little bit about what's happening on the national scene with appraisals, and discrimination in that field. We'll next have Marcela Bettencourt, and Marcela is the director of the Latino Policy Institute at Roger Williams University. She's going to give us some ideas about the impact that the Latino community has in Rhode Island, and just to help see what kind of economic impact is there. We next will have Kano Morales. Anna is the Associate Vice President of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, and that is for Rhode Island College. She's going to share some personal experiences about discrimination, whether out and out discrimination or implicit bias. Sometimes that's an area that we might lose when we're talking about fair housing. We tend to focus on the laws. What can you do? What can you not do? But sometimes we forget there's a person at the end of that kind of misconduct. We'll then hear, and this is a long list of folks, we will then hear from Jason Flanders. Jason, some of you may have heard speak before. He is the HUD Project Director for the Rhode Island Commission for Human Rights, and they enforce fair housing laws in Rhode Island, and he does it on behalf of HUD as well. Then finally, we'll have Ian Colomer. Ian is the policy specialist for the Rhode Island Coalition Against Domestic Violence. Many people may not be aware that victims of domestic violence are considered a protected class under fair housing laws. So that's important to keep in mind. Ian will have some helpful information for us. Okay, thanks again for joining us. And I'm going to start with Susan Martin Phipps to give us an idea of what's going on in the national perspective. Susan, go right ahead.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. There's been quite a bit of talk, and I know most of the people on the participants here are agents or brokers. I'm not sure if there are any appraisers going on, but there's been quite a bit of activity in the past year regarding appraisals and appraisal bias. President Biden, when he took over, his main concern was that the housing stock in America was properly evaluated. And there's been a lot of reports that undervalued communities have been undervalued as a result of either poor appraisal practices or discrimination. So he set forth, and you can see it on your screen, this PAVE commission, and it was Property Appraisal and Valuation Equity Report. All those little buttons you see on the side are all the participants that took place in this. It started about a year ago, and the report just came out in March. Now, NAR has been a participant in looking at this report as the months went on. We were actively participating as part of the Property Evaluation Committee of NAR. So we have seen the report. We did have input on the report. There are some things that we have issues with, but there's some really good things that have come out of the report. And I'd just like to go through them because there's going to be some changes that you're going to be seeing as you get your properties, your clients' properties appraised. So basically, the PAVE report out a month ago outlined several concerns regarding appraisals, and it was in response to potential implicit bias and also confirmation bias. Is the appraiser just going out there and confirming the sales price without actually doing much of the work? So some of the recommendations that have been made through the PAVE report, and we're working very closely with them, is a standardization and consistent method to actually reconsider the value. So I'm sure, especially now, many of you have had some issues with appraisals not coming into value. Some lenders have a reconsideration of value process in which they ask you certain questions. Do you have other better comps? Do you have anything that was materially incorrect about the appraisal? But it's not right now a consistent way to do it. The Veterans Administration, their lending process has a process called Tidewater, which is their reconsideration of value. And basically the appraisers, when they're doing an appraisal for a VA, they'll take a look at the appraisal, they'll do some of the work, but if they're having an issue, they will let everybody know that there's an issue. And they'll pretty much say to the brokers, hey, listen, I'm having a problem. Can you help me out? Is there something about the competing homes that I don't know about? So that you have an opportunity before the appraisal is actually written to give some feedback. So we are working on the standardization of the ROV. It's called an ROV, reconsideration of value. So I think that's going to be a very valuable instrument. The other thing, one of the other things is creating a more robust fair housing program for appraisers. So we as realtor agents, we have the Fair Haven program, which hopefully all have gone through. It's very, very interesting, basically setting up scenarios in which you have a way to discern how you would respond to the situation and if there is in fact implicit bias going on. I've been through the program, it's excellent, but it deals with mostly sales. So NAR is trying to come up with basically a fair haven for appraisers to really shed light on the implicit bias. I see that Alexa is on. Is Alexa able to come on right now? Does she want to jump in? I know she's got time constraints.
No, please finish, Susan.
Okay.
I can go when you're done.
Okay, thank you, Alexa. So some of the things to create a better fair housing program for appraisers is adding a fair housing component to the USPAP education. We as appraisers have to take a 15-hour USPAP course at the beginning of our training, and then every 2 years we have to take a 7-hour course. So they have just embedded a 1.5-hour fair housing, anti-bias, implicit bias training in that program. Also, again, as I said, fair housing component for real estate agents, which I'm sure you're all completing because we have to complete it within the next 15 days. So all the appraisers have to take that as well, appraiser realtors. One of the big things that you're going to be seeing on the streets, so to speak, is changing the way collateral lending appraising is done. So right now, pretty much you see me come out there, I come with my little clipboard, I take measurements of the house, I do my report, 2 weeks later, I hand it in. They are now, and you may have seen that there are a lot of appraisal waivers going on. If the lender can use previous data to confirm the validity of the sales price, and this is usually done with sales, not refinances. And if there's enough equity in the property, an appraiser may not even be needed according to the lender. So that's a complete waiver. If they don't have enough information, they may send out a property data collector. And I know that they're already out there. So these are people who are not appraisers, but they've been trained to take the property data and send it to the lender. It's usually a vetted third-party person that's this property data collector. And it's a group of people that's now being culled. So there's not that many of them. If some of you are looking for jobs, like to supplement your income, I know they're advertising already for these property data collectors, and it fits in perfectly with the agents. The other appraisal process that could be used is the desktop appraisal. Now, this became kind of popular during COVID, where the appraiser or the homeowner did not want somebody coming into their house. So literally I would do an appraisal sitting at my desk. I'd drive by the property. I would get all the information that there was available. If there was an MLS, if there was information on the town website, I would use that, submit my report. And that's called a desktop appraisal. Another appraisal is the hybrid appraisal, in which you have a property data collector and you have the drive-by. And then the final is the traditional appraisal, where you'll see me or another appraiser coming in with our clipboard and trying to figure out, measure the whole house, take the inspection, take all that information. That's usually going to be for complex assignments, properties over a certain amount, properties that maybe the equity is not as high as the lender would like. So you'll still be seeing us out there, but these are changes that are coming really fast. So definitely a way to change. The final thing I want to talk about is the opportunities for entrance into the profession. As you know, most of the appraisers that you see out there, I'm actually one of the younger ones. So it's an aging population. They're trying to get new appraisers in. It's been very difficult. It's very difficult to get an appraisal license. It's multiple hours of testing, it's multiple hours of classes, and then it's 1,000 hours with a mentor. And that's been really the pileup. There's not that many supervisors out there for the new appraisers. They are developing a new program called Korea, and PREA is Practical Applications in Real Estate Appraising. And that's when the person trying to get the license will be using a simulated, on computer education for part of that mentor program. And we do hope that helps the profession. I think my time is almost up, but there's some resources. Now, these resources are mostly if you have a complaint, particularly a fair housing complaint. There's some different ways to go. The first resource there is that PAVE report I was talking about. I think it's about 38 pages, interesting to go through. If you have an appraisal complaint, there are several ways to go about it. Refer my appraisal complaint, which is run by the ASC, the appraisal subcommittee. They will usually refer you to the state agency. So the state of Rhode Island has a regulatory board for appraisers. I happen to be on it. We view all complaints extremely seriously. We view all discrimination complaints extremely seriously. And when you go through that complaint process, what happens is one of the appraisers on the board will take a look at and review the appraisal. It's a long process, and we'll really see if there's, was it a bad appraisal? Was information incorrect? Was there any inkling of racial bias going on? So again, take these, we can't do anything unless people complain. So if you feel that your clients have been a victim of this, please take the time to file a complaint. Other ways to do it is through the Association of Realtors. If your appraiser is a realtor, they have to abide also by the Code of Ethics. So again, don't sit back on it. We really need to stop this. Nobody wants appraisal bias. Nobody wants discrimination. The only way to stop it is to get those bad players out of the field. So I will be available to answer questions afterwards. Thank you very much.
Susan, thanks so much for pinch hitting there. I'd like to introduce our next speaker, who is from the National Association of Realtors. Alexis Smokler is the Director of NAR Fair Housing Policy and Program. And I will say before Alexis speaks, one quick announcement, which is Jason Flanders, who you'll be hearing from later, also mentioned that if you have any concerns about appraisals and discrimination, you can also contact the Rhode Island Commission for Human Rights. Okay, over to you, Alexia. Thank you very much for joining us.
So good morning, Rhode Island. Thank you for the invitation. As Monica mentioned, my name is Alexia Smokler, and I'm NAR's Director of Fair Housing Policy and Programs. My position is new. I'm part of a fair housing team at NAR that didn't exist 2 years ago. We have made fair housing a priority. It hasn't always been so. Like much of America, it's been a journey. But today, in 2022, we believe the real estate industry has a special role to play in the fight for fair housing. So today, I'm going to give you an update about how NAR is putting that commitment into action. So let me share my screen here. It's my privilege, in addition to doing policy advocacy for NAR here in Washington, to lead the implementation of NAR's ACT Fair Housing Initiative. ACT is an acronym. It stands for Accountability, Culture Change, and Training. It's a package of industry reforms and tools for members, associations, and brokerages, shoring up our own house. Why did we launch ACT? Many of you may remember that in November 2019, a newspaper on Long Island, New York, called Newsday, published a hidden camera investigation about alleged discrimination by real estate agents. And it rocked us. For those of you who aren't familiar, let me give you a quick recap of what Newsday was all about. Long Island, home to some 3 million people east of New York City, is one of the most segregated areas in the country. It's also one of the most diverse, but folks live in pockets. People at Newsday had heard anecdotally, and I believe some of their Black employees had actually experienced, that real estate agents were contributing to the problem with steering. And so they launched this 3-year testing study together with some fair housing experts to look at how the top brokerages on Long Island were treating clients of different backgrounds. You may be familiar with discrimination testing. It's kind of like secret shopping. There are two testers posing as clients. They both have the same qualifications. They're even dressed the same. And they're looking for the same kind of house, in the same general location, on the same budget. The only difference between them is their race, national origin, disability, or whatever characteristic is being tested. They each go into a brokerage separately to see what kind of treatment they receive, and then that treatment is compared. If the methodology is good, and in Newsday it was airtight, courts consider testing evidence to be some of the most persuasive evidence a plaintiff in a discrimination case can bring. And what Newsday caught on hidden camera, according to the analysis from the fair housing experts, was that real estate agents treated the white tester and the tester of color differently in 40% of interactions. 19% when the tester was Asian American, 39% when the tester was Hispanic, 49%, almost half the time, when the tester was Black. According to the investigation, agents showed the testers of color fewer listings. They steered them to different neighborhoods based on their race and national origin. They required some to be pre-approved to go out and see listings and not others based on their race. And they told them different things about crime, neighborhoods, and schools. I would encourage you, if you haven't watched the documentary yet, to check it out. It's really a case study in what not to do if you want to stay on the right side of fair housing law. After Newsday published the investigation, the New York State Legislature launched hearings. They subpoenaed agents and brokers. They've passed legislation, and additional investigations are ongoing. Newsday received national media attention. It was cited in congressional testimony here in Washington. So this story dropped on us like a bombshell. Those videos showed us that we needed to do better, that we needed to hold ourselves to a higher standard. We know this isn't just a New York problem. We've seen real estate discrimination documented in testing studies conducted by the government and by research institutions. Now, it just so happens that 3 weeks before publication of the Newsday investigation, NAR had hired the head of fair housing enforcement at HUD, Brian Green, to be its new director of fair housing. Brian is my current and former boss. I also used to work in fair housing enforcement at HUD. And so NAR was well positioned to respond. We immediately proposed this new initiative to our leadership team, and they approved it right away. Again, accountability, culture change, and training. Part of it is to make sure that we hold real estate professionals accountable when they violate fair housing laws. But also, we want to shift hearts and minds so that equal service is something that is woven into the way we serve consumers and the public. So that when we say that realtors hold themselves to the highest ethical standard, upholding fair housing is core to that. So let's talk about the components of ACT. Accountability. Self-testing. NAR is creating a program for brokerages who want to voluntarily test themselves for discrimination. This will allow a brokerage to uncover and address problems confidentially before a newspaper or a private fair housing group does. We have a pilot underway right now where a broker is working with an experienced testing organization to assess how her agents are complying with fair housing law. She will receive a confidential report, we won't see it, and then follow-up training for any problems that may be uncovered. We've had many other brokerages express interest in self-testing, and we'll be ramping up our program's capacity over the next couple of years. We also continue to advocate for strong federal fair housing enforcement, both in our regulatory comment letters to HUD and in the talking points our members take to Capitol Hill. We urge strong funding of HUD's enforcement programs. We believe that strong fair housing enforcement, including testing, is essential to ensuring a real estate market that serves all consumers fairly. Also on the accountability front, we've reviewed the real estate licensure laws of all 50 states and 4 territories. There is great variability among the states when it comes to fair housing education and discipline for licensees. Some states don't require any fair housing training for their licensees. We've shared our research with our state associations, along with a set of best practices, so that they can examine their own licensing law to make sure it's holding licensees to an appropriately high standard. I took a look at Rhode Island's law using this nifty reporter that you can see on the screen. And I see that you've just added 3 hours of required fair housing training for CE effective this year. Bravo, that's great. You're doing better than 2/3 of the states. But I also saw that you don't appear to require any fair housing training in your pre-license requirements. And someone please correct me if I'm wrong, but that's a place where your law might be stronger. Now, the next 2 prongs of ACT, culture change and training, work in tandem with each other. We're very excited about a new video series and award we've just launched of Realtor Fair Housing Champion, embracing as part of their business strategy. Later this month, we're going to be announcing our new Fair Housing Champions who will receive an award and some funds to dedicate to their favorite local fair housing related nonprofit organization. You'll be able to see the champions win their awards and hear a discussion about closing the racial home ownership gap at our Fair Housing Month event on April 27th. And there's a link in the chat for you to register. We're also introducing new and innovative training opportunities for realtors. Back in 2020, we released a 50-minute training video on implicit bias in real estate. And this month, we're launching a 3-hour classroom course on implicit bias that we've made ready for CE credit. So what is implicit bias? Susan mentioned it a moment ago. It's the way that our brains automatically and often without our awareness attribute stereotypes to people that we're not familiar with. We all do it. It's the way our human brains work. It's a shortcut to help us categorize things quickly and make sense of all the information coming at us. But it can be a problem because if we haven't had a lot of exposure to other groups, a lot of those shortcuts are based on stereotypes that we get from media and culture. They aren't true. And so even as our conscious minds may hold fairness and equal treatment as cherished values, our unconscious minds may be causing us to treat people differently or unfairly without our even intending to. And that can lead you down the road to a fair housing violation. You're making assumptions about people based on their identity, based on stereotypes. That could lead you into steering. It could lead you into denying equal professional service. So we all need to be very careful that we aren't letting those mental shortcuts make bad decisions for us. Our new classroom training will teach agents tactics to interrupt stereotypical thinking and avoid fair housing pitfalls so that they can be sure they are seeing every customer or client as an individual, not a stereotype, who is treated with equal concern, respect, and service. And then you might have heard about something we launched at the end of 2020 called Fair Haven, a fair housing simulation. Susan just mentioned it. Fairhaven is really a new approach to fair housing training. There isn't anything else like it out there. We decided to create it not long after Newsday was published. We saw in more than one of those hidden camera videos, agents referencing their fair housing training. They talked about what they weren't supposed to do. They named it, like steering. They said, I'm not supposed to, and then they did it anyway. Something wasn't connecting. We could see that we needed a new kind of fair housing training, something that really resonated with realtors to teach not only the substance of the law, but that would move more agents to deeply embrace it. And that's how we came up with Fairhaven. It's not your traditional lecture and quiz. You won't need to know what year a law was passed or memorize any provisions. We wanted to give members a chance to practice applying fair housing principles in scenarios that feel real. And so as we developed Fairhaven, we reviewed real fair housing cases and talked to members about their frequently asked fair housing questions. Now, a very special feature of Fairhaven is that the learner is also put in the shoes of a client who is stopped from buying a house because of discrimination. You'll see things from that client's point of view and confront the decisions that client might have to make. The goal here was to elicit an emotional reaction in the learner, to open the learner up to perspectives that they hadn't considered, and to evoke empathy and ultimately behavior change. So we've set the bar high with this training. It's our goal for learners to come out of the experience seeing the world a little bit differently. And learners have told us that they got angry or tearful when experiencing the client's point of view. They've told us that it gave them new motivation to stand up for clients in situations that didn't feel right. We're very proud of what we've created here, and I would encourage all of you, if you haven't been there yet, to take a visit. It's a free member benefit that you can access at fairhaven.realtor. It takes about an hour to an hour and a half to complete. You can pause your progress and come back at any time. So if you haven't visited Fairhaven yet, in honor of Fair Housing Month, log in and try this training. That's all I have for today, and now I'd be happy to take your questions.
Alexia, thank you so much. I just wanted to mention, you're absolutely right about the continuing education requirement that Rhode Island has. You're also right that there is no specific requirement that a pre-licensing class teach fair housing. However, as of January 1st of this year, a new law makes it crystal clear that fair housing will be tested on any pre-licensing exam for brokers or sales licenses. So if you're going to a school that hasn't caught up with the times, you're going to have some trouble if the school isn't teaching you about fair housing. Really critical information. I guess your work here is done. That's a lot of information to unpack. Our association has really tried to promote a lot of the programs that you've mentioned, but we really appreciate your taking the time to be with us, especially after starting off with a stressful morning. So, okay.
I'm just glad I was able to squeak in the nick of time. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you very much, Alexia. Have a great day.
Okay, bye-bye, everybody.
Okay. I think we are now. And so you've got Alexia's contact information. Feel free to reach out to her and any of the other panelists who will be sharing their contact information later if they wish. Okay, next up, our next presenter is going to be Marcela Bettencourt. And as a reminder, she's the director of the Latino Policy Institute at Roger Williams. And her institute puts out all kinds of really useful information and reports for those of you who'd like to know more about how the Latino population is working, making a difference in the Rhode Island economy, etc. So without further ado, Marcela, take it away. Feel free to unmute yourself and show yourself on screen.
Thank you so much, Monica. And thank you everybody for having me. It's a pleasure to start this really beautiful Thursday with everybody. As Monica mentioned, I'm the director of the Latino Policy Institute. I've been here for a little bit over 3 years, but our organization has actually existed for over 15. You'll actually hear from my predecessor, Kano Morales, in a little bit, who was here for quite a few years and also did really amazing work, which and as Monica mentioned, you can see in our website, which I'll put it in the chat for a second. So what does our organization do? We make sure that through communication, expertise, reports, also connections, we look into public policy, how public policy impacts the lives of Latinos, especially I like thinking about it as the evolving lives of Latinos, and why that evolution is because I am a first generation Latina. My mom came to this country when I was 12 years old. While I was born in this country, I grew up in Colombia, and my experience and the experience of other Latinos, if they're foreign born, if they're first, second, or third generation, it is very different. And so it was incredibly important for me coming into the Latino Policy Institute that we were able to highlight and underscore the different experiences of Latinos as we evolve. And so one of the things that I wanted to start off with is to share a little bit about the amazing things that our community does. And so hopefully many of you already know that, but as of the 2020 census, there is an incredible number so every single city and town in the state of Rhode Island has a Latino that lives there. So there's, even if it's small percentages, there's Latinos that live in every single corner of our state. And that is incredibly important. And what does that mean? It means that that as we've been saying for the last few decades, we are an integral part of the state. And not only do we invest in the state through its economy, but we also need and expect the state to do the same as our community and population keeps growing. Some of the cities that had some of the largest and most interesting population growth were actually the city of North Providence and Johnston. So their the Latino population actually doubled between 2010 and 2020. Other communities in the urban core that you'd expect, like Providence and Central Falls, obviously also grew a lot, but North Providence and Johnston have grown. And we believe that that's, these are cities who are very close in proximity to to the core of where, many of us grew up and live. But housing can be a bit more affordable. There is more housing just in general. And so and again, this trend happens with generations. It's really important for me to make sure and underscore too that when we talk about the Latino community, we also talk about the great things that we do, not just talk about our communities in a deficit mindset. So while I'll be sharing with you some numbers that are concerning to us at the Latino Policy Institute and at other policy organizations about our community, I also do want to continue to underscore that our Latino community is incredibly important to the state. We are entrepreneurs. We are leaders in state government as well as in the private and public sector. We have been in the state for many, many, many decades, and we will continue to grow thanks to the Latino community. Actually, for now 20 years, we've been able to continue to keep a congressional seat since it's one of the only populations that grows. And so that's something that's really important. But then taking us into what we're discussing today, one of the numbers that I wanted to share with you all is a little bit concerning in regards to homeownership. So our partner here within Rhode Williams Housing Works Rhode Island every year puts a fact book out that outlines a lot of different issues regarding housing access. And one of those is homeownership. Homeownership for Latinos in the state of Rhode Island is 30%. So 30% of Latinos of homeowners in Rhode Island are Latino. And that is actually 19 points below the national average. So again, the national average is 49%, of homeowners are Latinos. And in Rhode Island is about 30%. And so that's incredibly concerning. Something that's even more layered is that 40% of Latino homeowners are cost burden, which, for the work that, everyone here is doing and the work that we do really can create really difficult ripple effects. Especially because, within our communities, we're told that homeownership is part of wealth, and it's how you build it for generational wealth. And so when we have 40% of homeowners, of Latino homeowners, really having difficulties with being able to afford their home, it can really impact how that generational wealth is passed on and what happens. So it is something that is incredibly concerning to us. And it's, and that it happens for several reasons. One of those is currently the latest information that we have, the median income for Latino families is $44,000. And that is compared to about 60,000, like median income for about a white family is about nearly $60,000, about that. So when we look at this data, when we look at $44,000, and then we actually look again at the Housing Works fact book that I referenced earlier, in 2021, they outlined that there's not a single city or town in the state of Rhode Island where a family with $44,000 can purchase a home that without being overly cost burden. And so that is incredibly concerning to the community, to our community, because it also adds on to why we're seeing these this disparity among homeownership. And it's sadly a trend that has continued for many decades. And it really can and will impact the future of our Latino generations. Something that I also just wanted to share as a fun fact is, so for those, so Latin America has several countries, but in the state of Rhode Island, those with the highest origin of countries are Dominican Republic and Guatemala. And that has sort of switched and changed with time. But Dominican Republic has sort of stayed at the top. One of the other things that it's incredibly important that goes back to the evolving Latino generation and community is when, and we talked a little bit about bias, Latinos are sometimes thought of or expected as immigrant or people who only speak Spanish, and so I think one of the things that I wanted to share is that our community is incredibly different. So not every Latino is an immigrant. Individuals that are from Puerto Rico are technically not immigrants. Many individuals will not speak Spanish, even if they choose to identify as Latino. And so it's when we talk about bias and thought and things of like that, it's incredibly important that I highlight that there are, especially in this latest census, any of you who may have taken a look at it, this was the first time in the country that individuals chose more than one race as their racial makeup, and Latinos were a big part of that. And that has changed over since the 50s and 60s. Many times Latinos, we chose white, and that has very big historical racial reasons of why we do that. But now with time, not only Latinos, but other ethnic communities have been doing the same. And so it's incredibly important that one, you realize that all Latinos are not immigrants, that all Latinos do not speak Spanish, or Latinos look a little bit different. And in our state, Latinos sadly still have a very high average of living in poverty or being in communities where poverty is prevalent. And nevertheless, I think hopefully what this work can do is really understand what are some of the other barriers that our Latino community is facing when it comes to homeownership. So while cost burden might be one of them, hopefully what we will hear later when Anna and others speak is what are some of the other barriers that our communities are facing regarding some discrimination issues or just access issues. So again, thank you so much. I hope that in the very little time that I was able to share with you, you were able to learn a little bit more, I'll be happy to share our website with you all, as well as the housing fact book that I referenced, because it's incredibly important and interesting information that comes out every year from our partners at HousingWorks. So thank you so much for having me.
Marcela, thank you so much for so generously giving of your time and educating us about what the Policy Institute does. What I would suggest to everyone is most of the speakers, except for Alexia, really just have about 10 minutes today. And our goal is for this to just be the start of these conversations and programs and relationships. So this is just enough to give you kind of a snippet to find out, are there areas that you're more interested in? Are there programs that you'd like the Realtor Association to offer, et cetera? But I do encourage you to check out, oh, good, Marcela's already posted in the chat how you can find out more about the Latino Policy Institute. Before I introduce our next speaker, I just want to give a shout out to Alex Parmenides, if he is still with us this morning. Alex is the one who told us about the next speaker and said, you must have her come and do a presentation at RIAR. And then she in turn recommended Marcela. So thank you, Alice. You got us two folks. All right. So our next speaker is Ana Cano Morales. And just in case you missed the earlier introduction, she's the Associate Vice President of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Rhode Island College. And when we first contacted her, she said, you must contact Marcela Bettencourt. So, all right, take it away, Anna. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. I appreciate it, Monica. And it's a pleasure to be here on this Zoom webinar with the rest of the panelists, and hopefully engaging, even though it's virtual, with all of you. My name is Ana Cano Morales, and I am the Associate Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Rhode Island College. And I love to follow Marcela because for many reasons. She's a little sister that I never had. And also I'm very proud of the work that she's doing to highlight, to continue to highlight the story of Latinos in our journey here in Rhode Island through facts, through policies, and through recommendations that really are good for all Rhode Island. With a particular highlight on Latinos, which is an ever-growing population in our, not just our state, but in the region in New England. And so I'll start with kind of continuing to pull the thread that Marcela has shown us or has presented to us, and that is that we're both Colombian, and I happen to be born here. And I've never lived in Colombia. My parents came to the United States from Medellin, Colombia in the 1960s. So when Marcela was talking about the early kind of pioneers, the early immigrants from South America or from Latin America or Central America even, my parents were part of that first wave back in the late 60s. And they came here to work in the Blackstone Valley area of Rhode Island, which was the textile industry, a lot of mills, a lot of factories. And so my parents were laborers. Both my mother and my father worked in the textile mills in the late 60s and all throughout the 70s and early 80s until those industries either ceased to exist or went to other parts of the nation or went offshore to other nations, other countries like China. And so my American dream story is very much tied to their immigration to the United States. I am a Rhode Islander, born and raised, as I just told you. And so what I have found when I listen and when I reflect on some of the work that is going on right now in terms of making housing accessible, fair, equitable, and making sure that the profession that you all represent in terms of realtors and in the realty industry is really examining bias and really examining how discrimination can get stamped out through trainings, through programs, through accountability, right? And through real intentional leadership is really refreshing this morning. But I can really tell you just my 10 minutes, my spiel is going to be, how does that affect just a family here in Rhode Island, right? What has been my experience and how have I benefited from it, from having opportunities, and what could have been different with my experience as well. And I have found that the American dream is sometimes very un-American. I'll say that again. The American dream is sometimes very un-American, in particular for people of color, for people who maybe English is not their first language, for people who may just be different than what these systems were meant to serve. And I work at a public higher education institution, Rhode Island College, and Rhode Island College was not made for me. It was not made for Marcela. It was not made for many of the students that currently we have at Rhode Island College. And so how do we try to dismantle systems that were created for people who are monolingual, people who are white, people who are able-bodied, really just a different prototype and not at all the demographics that we have right now, either Rhode Island College or in Rhode Island. And so when we hear the trends of the census, saying how we've had some huge growth in certain communities in Rhode Island, it's not new to me. It's not new to many of us who have been here for now a couple of generations. So how do these policies, programs, trainings, and everything, how does that all kind of come to fruition in my life? Well, I can tell you that when my parents were looking to buy their first home, they first of all, they didn't use a realtor. So how about that? Back in the 80s, they didn't trust a realtor. They didn't know who a realtor was. I was their realtor, and I was just a young kid, probably in middle school at the time, having to translate documents, having to go to a bank, having to navigate a mortgage lending situation, having to do inspections or translate inspections for people, having to go to a town hall, having to, I actually should probably want to be one of those appraisers that that was mentioned earlier, because I probably can earn an honorary certificate for the kind of translation, the kind of code switching and navigation that I did as a young child, as a parentified child, and many immigrant young people who are growing up in households where they have to be the cultural navigator, the cultural translator for their families. It is on us. If I didn't get that right, my family wouldn't purchase their first house. Think about that. It was on the child. It was on the adolescent to find the home for the family, to do the negotiation. And so I don't know what I don't know, right? And so that was my experience. My family did purchase a house. It was in a very blue collar section of Pawtucket. It's called the Woodlawn section of Pawtucket. And it was what we could afford, or what my parents could afford. And that was kind of their first home. About 10 or 15 years later, they sold that house and they purchased another home in Providence. There, they did use a realtor. And guess what? They used a realtor because they couldn't use me anymore because I was in college. I wasn't around. But they used somebody who spoke their language and who wasn't Latino, but they happened to have a really good command of the Spanish language. And so they were able to gain that person's trust and ask the questions they wanted to ask. And they had already gone through it before. They had already been homeowners. And so they had an advantage. And so they went to Providence and they purchased that home. They stayed in that home for over 25 years until they both unfortunately passed away, just a couple of years in between of each other. And they lived to be in their 80s and 90s. And so they lived to be, they lived a good long life. And so why do I bring all of that up? Because the issues of accessibility, the issues of representation really do matter. I hear a lot of emphasis on programs and training and making sure that we say something if we think something is discriminatory, making sure that we assess for discrimination, but really representation matters. Linguistic representation matters, cultural representation matters, racial representation matters. And so how do we diversify our realty firms? How do we diversify the membership of the Realtors Association? How do we ensure that we're making this a profession that is accessible to people from all walks of life and from all diversities? So that's one thing that I would highlight that I don't think I've heard a lot this morning, but I think would be a great topic for a future conversation. That's one. And the second thing is, we should talk a little bit about how those two purchases of those homes for my parents have helped me and now my children, who are one in college and one in high school. And so what that did was it provided social mobility for my family. It provided generational wealth. We don't talk about that very often, but it provided equity. It provided credit. It provided the ability for us to actually have an estate that would be, or assets that would be transferred over to the next generation. It provided some confidence and some stability where if my children and my son decided to go to graduate school after he finishes his undergrad, that I would be able to have some equity to be able to finance that. That is what I think people take for granted all the time. They don't think about it. They don't give it a second thought because, of course, grandma is going to leave us the house, or our parents may allow us to live in the house when they go to the nursing home, or we may have a second income because we have now this empty house if our parents move to Florida or to Georgia or to Texas or something. And so now we have a second income because we're renting that home. That's all about wealth building. And that's another aspect I think that could be perhaps teased out in future conversations with this group of people and with others to join, which looks at social mobility and asset building, in particular looking at equity. Who has access to that and who doesn't? And when I was the Latino Policy Institute director before Marcela, one of the statistics that sticks in my head and wouldn't let me sleep at night is the fact that 75% of Latinos back in 2000 and I believe 14, that was the report, were renters and not homeowners in Rhode Island. 75% of Latinos in Rhode Island, I think in 2014, were renters. They were not homeowners. And that continues to be a fact or a statistic that scares the bejesus out of me, because there's an economy, a larger economy that we are not contributing to because we don't have access to contribute to. And then there's also implications, I think, for the market, for the housing market. And more importantly, the point that I want to definitely stress is that generational wealth, that upward mobility or social mobility, is not being transferred over to the next generation. And so that leads to a bleak outcome or future for people from marginalized identities like Latinos. That's what I wanted to say. I wanted to probably the last thing, I'm just going to look over my notes and make sure that I didn't miss anything. I think the last thing that I will say is I'm a homeowner myself, obviously. And I say obviously because it's of course it's an obvious thing, right? My parents had a home. See what I mean? There's an expectation that I think generations of families, particularly Latinos or African-American families, don't get to experience. For me, it's an expectation that my children are going to own their own homes. They might actually have multiple homes because I experienced that as a young person growing up, that my family, owned a home. I've been in this home, in my home for 22 years, and in a community that Marcela just highlighted and having kind of a growth in Latinos, and that is North Providence. And so I bought this home back in 2000, the year 2000. I've been here for 22 years. And it has been a neighborhood that I have seen grow in diversity. I've seen an aging population here in North Providence unfortunately pass away or move on to other parts of the community in terms of assisted living or retirement, or moving out of the state altogether to some other part of the country, moving in with their kids, and seeing much more of a younger community here in North Providence, just in and around my neighborhood, with more diverse people, young professionals with children, because we are younger, especially Latinos, are half the age of the average non-Latino, non-minority in Rhode Island. I think the average age of a Latino back in the day, Marcela, correct me if I'm wrong, but the average age of a Latino in Rhode Island is 26. And the average age of a Rhode Islander who has not a minority or white Rhode Islander is, I think, in the late 40s, maybe 47 or 46. We're half the age. And we are in, obviously, not me anymore, because I'm considered one of the dinosaurs, one of the older people in the Latino community. So I'm not of childbearing age any longer, but the majority of us are. And that has huge implications for home ownership, has huge implications for our neighborhoods and our community. And it has a huge implication for our state and the vitality of our state. So I thank you very much for the opportunity to be able to share my own personal story and reflection on what I've heard this morning. And thank you for the invitation.
Marcela, thank you so much. Actually, as you were speaking, since I had my screen off, you couldn't see that I was nodding my head, because you reminded me of something that others listening may have had similar experiences in their family. My mom and her parents, my grandparents on my mom's side, came here as refugees when Stalin invaded their country of Estonia, and they landed in a rural farming community in Ohio where no one had ever heard of Estonia, their country. And my mom was the one who was kind of had to get kind of a crash course in English and ended up having to translate for everybody, interpret for everybody. And so even though you were born here, Anna, it's still that same issue about, having parents from a different generation, people raised in a different language. And that it's just so important to remember that. And I do want to say too, that I want to thank Anna and Marcela particularly, because when we had a conversation, when we were first planning this program, I'd mentioned to them some things that the leadership of the Realtor Association were investigating, how to make our forums more inclusive to people and the real estate transaction more inclusive to people who are not necessarily fluent in English or would prefer to deal in a different language. And I don't know if you remember what you said, but it really stuck. Do you want to say it? Do you remember what you said?
I say so many things.
Okay, I can say it. No, I can say it. I know you do. No, I can say it. It just would come better from you. But no, I think what you said was, well, why are we talking about kind of including people, making room with them for the table? Like how to like the default is white people who speak English or fluent in English. So why are we kind of like making room for them at other people at the kids' table, instead of just saying like, look, we've got a diverse population of people who speak different languages or from different cultural backgrounds, different classes, etc. Why don't we just plan everything with everybody in mind instead of trying to squeeze people in?
Yeah, it's the difference between diversity and inclusion is what I was trying to articulate, probably not in a very thoughtful manner, but it's the difference between diversity and inclusion. Inclusion is really, including culturally and organizationally the diversity within everything that you do, right? Not everything needs to be done to people, or, we need to make sure that things are done in Spanish. Well, no, they can be done in, or vice versa, like turn it around. Maybe the interpreting needs to be done on those who are monolingual.
Mm-hmm.
Instead of those who may be bilingual but may need a little extra help because their grasp of the English language is not what it needs to be, or maybe it's not fully conversational. And so maybe the translation or the Spanish or any other language, Portuguese, fluency needs to be the ones that are adopted by the monolingual community, not necessarily the bilingual or the English emerging community. So it's a mindset. It's a mindset. It's a positive mindset instead of a deficit mindset. And I think that Marcela said something very similar in her presentation.
Yes. So thank you both. And that's why I wanted to plug that implicit bias class, because I think it really shapes how you think about things. Okay, let's move on to our next presenter. Jason Flanders is no stranger to the Realtor Association. Some of you may have met him for the first time just about a year ago when a new law went into effect that changed fair housing laws. Jason also has begun to teach fair housing classes for the Realtor Association. And since I've said his name 5 times, Jason Flanders is also the HUD project director for the Rhode Island Commission for Human Rights. Jason, thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you for having me. Good morning, everybody. I'm not going to say my name again, but I'm the HUD project director for the Commission for Human Rights. And what we are is the state agency that enforces both state and federal anti-discrimination law. We deal with the housing law, so Title VIII of the Civil Rights Act and also the Fair Housing Practices Act. Someone earlier mentioned protected categories, and we have a pretty long list of those. So we have race, color, sex, religion, national origin, disability, age, a lot to remember, sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression. So all of our laws cover those. So that includes our employment law, credit law. But we also, in housing, cover familial status, which is families with minor children, marital status, victims of domestic abuse are a protected category under our law. Military status, as long as you're not dishonorably discharged. If you're denied housing because you're military or you're asked things that may not be okay, they are allowed to ask how long you'll be living there though, or how long your assignment is. So there's a little confusion there. Housing status, whether or not you're homeless. And then there is the newest one, which is the source of income law. So lawful source of income, and it has to be lawful. That came out April 15th, 2021. That was signed into law by the governor. And what that says is that landlords, realtors, real estate agents, owners cannot deny housing based on the fact you have a lawful source of income. But what does that mean? So the main ones that are listed, the big one, and this is the one everybody knows, is Section 8, the housing choice voucher for HUD, which is they give you a voucher, you go out and find private housing, and a landlord accepts that, and they get guaranteed money every month, which blows my mind why you wouldn't take that. And what we found is with Section 8, now it's not, this lawful source of income is not federally protected. That's a state only law. But during our research, when we were looking up the law, we found that under federal law, it actually has what's called an adverse impact, which means there's this policy that generally looks like it's neutral on its face. But when you dig deeper into it, it has a much larger negative impact on certain populations. And with the no Section 8, we found that the two populations in our state which are most affected are African Americans and disabled individuals. For example, I'll give you some stats. In the state of Rhode Island, 27% of the population is considered disabled. This is according to the Centers for Disease Control. 47% of those individuals have a housing choice voucher. Almost half of that population has a housing choice voucher, a Section 8 voucher to get housing. So if there's a no Section 8 policy, that population is greatly affected, more so than most others. So what we've done is under the lawful source of income law, we've added that language if the individual is disabled, and then if it's another type of case, which I'm going to get into in a minute. We also cover alimony, child support, any kind of Social Security that you may receive. And then another one that's pretty big that we see a lot of, which is one of the other main cases that we get, is rent relief. Rhode Island Housing has a rent relief program, Rent Relief RI, which I'm pretty sure everybody's heard of, where if someone's falling behind in their rent or they cannot pay their current rent, they will give money to the directly to the landlord, actually, paying the back rent or paying the rent that they are not able to afford. It is illegal to fail to participate in that program, be it filling out the forms that they need to do, accepting the money, what have you. It is illegal to say no to rent relief. So we've had the Section 8 cases, which are kind of our big one. Just the outright denial where someone says, no, I don't want to rent to you because you have Section 8. The second one we have is the source of rent relief. And the third one that we've seen is advertising, where we've seen ads online and mainly online, but I think we've seen one or two in a newspaper where it says no Section 8. Now, generally the way the commission works is somebody comes to us with a complaint and they say, hi, I feel I was discriminated against because of my race, color, sex, lawful source of income. And so we take in that complaint and we investigate it. So it's important for me to stress this. We are a neutral investigative agency. We are not an advocacy group. We don't represent one side or the other. We're not fighting for the complainant, which is what we call a plaintiff, or the respondent, which would be a defendant in court. What our job is simply to gather evidence and analyze that evidence and determine if there is a violation of the law. So generally what happens is someone comes in, files that claim, we gather evidence and we say yes or no, we feel that there is discrimination here. With the advertising cases, there's really no particular person that's at harm. It's more of a general public harm. And so within our statute, the commission itself, we have the authority to file charges as the Commission for Human Rights. So essentially it's the state of Rhode Island filing a charge. And we've had our first few cases that we had actually in the new law, which we're referred to because we unfortunately don't have the resources to go out there and look at every listing. But if someone brings it to our attention, we filed that case. And so this way we have to protect what's called the public interest. So what happens is the commission now becomes the plaintiff complainant, which is our term. And it's us, I don't like using the word suing, but alleging a violation. Now, since this law came out, which was April, we didn't really have a lot of cases in April or May, but our fiscal year starts July 1st. And since July 1st, we've taken in 38 total cases here at the commission. So we've had 38 charges come in. Of those, 12 of them have been source of income cases. So it's almost a third of our cases that are coming in since that law has passed. And it's kind of a pretty big problem. And I think the largest percentage is actually the rent relief. We've had a few of the advertising cases, I think about 4 or 5. The no Section 8 cases we've had a few of, but the rent relief is a big problem. Many landlords don't want to fill out the W-9. They don't respond to Rhode Island housing. I've had realtors who have in text messages straight up said, we don't participate in those programs. That again is illegal. It is no legal obligation to participate in that program. So what happens if there's a case against you and it goes what's called probable cause? So before that even happens, we do try to settle the cases. So not only do we act as neutral investigators, we're also, in a way, mediators. We do have some trained mediators on staff, but investigators do try to see if there's a way to settle the case. If it goes probable cause, so my job as an investigator is not to say yes or no for sure discrimination took place. What my job is to say, I think there's enough evidence here to go forward with the hearing. So once that happens, in every case that happens with, our attorney, Casey Brody, she becomes the civil prosecutor. So regardless of who actually filed the case, it officially becomes the state of Rhode Island versus respondent A, B, or C. And so it's up to her to actually build the case, prosecute the case, but always trying to settle the cases. And some of the provisions that we've had with settling is training is always a big one. It's always good to get all the knowledge out there and kind of teach everybody the do's and don'ts. With the advertising ones, we have a provision where for 1 year, they have to put a specific language in all of their advertisements that state that they will not discriminate based on all the protected categories in the state of Rhode Island. Policy changes, we review policies, make revisions. It's usually a lot bigger in our reasonable accommodation cases because a lot of housing providers or companies as such, their reasonable accommodation policies can use a little help. We notice that sometimes there's some things lacking or there's some language that really shouldn't be in there. There's also something called a community contribution, which is there's a monetary amount that we ask to be paid to a certain fair housing organization, which we have a list. And we do all that so we can avoid going into a hearing, because if it goes to a hearing and it goes in the commission's favor, I mean, it's going to be very expensive. We don't want that to happen. Plus, it kind of takes it off of everybody's desk, which is what we want. But yeah, so that's how the commission works. We do have a contract with HUD, which is why we cover the federal law as well. So if there's a case that falls within HUD's jurisdiction, as well as it meets the federal requirements, then what they do is they refer to us to investigate on their behalf. So our cases are both state and federal law for the most part, unless it's one of the categories, which is state only, which would be sexual orientation. We've been doing federal for that. Marital status is state only. Age, surprisingly, is a state only protected category, and it's 18 and over. So one of the age cases you might see is if somebody puts like college students only or young professionals, that is considered an age case. And one thing I do want to stress is that if you're working with a landlord or an owner and they have a discriminatory preference that they want, and we've had this case many times where they tell you, I don't want a certain population, or I want, young professionals or anything like that. If when you're working for them, you use that discriminatory preference, you're also liable for discrimination. So it would behoove you to maybe tell your client you cannot do that, to avoid any kind of liability for possible discrimination. So that is the Commission for Human Rights. I will put my contact information in the chat, and thank you very much.
Jason, thank you very much. I do want to thank Jason because many of you contact me with legal hotline questions. The majority of them I can answer, but every now and then I need to reach out to Jason for the more complicated ones. And he has very patiently gotten answers to the questions for me, which I can then pass on. So I appreciate that very much. Okay, I'm going to introduce.
And she loves to stump me, just to let you know. So please keep the questions coming.
Yes, I do. That's true. All right. Our final speaker this morning is Ian Colomer. And Ian is the policy specialist for the Rhode Island Commission Against Domestic Violence. And this tends, in my experience, this is one of those areas where people don't necessarily realize that victims and survivors of domestic violence are protected under Rhode Island fair housing laws. So Ian, please take it away.
Excellent. Thank you, Monica, and good morning to everyone. A big congratulations to all of our speakers. I think we all did an amazing job this morning, so I hope I can follow up with some of that, really great energy. So the Coalition Against Domestic Violence is the state coalition for our domestic violence programs in our state. Currently, we have a membership of 10 programs that either their mission is directly to end domestic violence or have some form of domestic violence programming at their organization. As stated earlier, I am the policy and housing coordinator for the coalition. I hold many, many hats. I recently got into this role, which brought me to this panel today. A few of you might have participated in our domestic violence and housing training that happened a few months ago. So if you want a little bit more information around domestic violence and housing, please feel free to reach out to the great staff that we have here so you can get a recording of that training. So the coalition focuses on policy and systems change. We have a prevention team that focuses on educating our community and changing the narrative on what domestic violence is. Domestic violence is a community issue, so it's on us to create a community response to end domestic violence in our state. I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about some data that is either specific to Rhode Island or nationally. So I'm also going to drop a couple of links towards the end of my presentation, and I do have a short video for you to watch. And I'm seeing that we're kind of getting close to our time here, so I'm going to try to keep it brief and quick. So domestic violence is a pattern of abuse within a relationship that escalates over time and consists of abusive and coercive behaviors that one person uses to establish and maintain power and control over their partner, which can take many different forms. Abusers will frequently use multiple types of abuse at once in order to maintain that control over their partner. So some of those types of abuse include physical, sexual, emotional, verbal and psychological, financial, and digital. So each year, the coalition and its member agencies serve about 9,000 adults and children across the state, and we answer over 15,000 calls to our statewide helpline and agency hotline. On average, we serve about 400 children and adults in our emergency shelter programs across the state. But due to the COVID-19 pandemic, the burden of finding safe and affordable housing has kept our survivors in shelter much longer. On average, victims and their families stay in shelter for about 3 months. That has escalated to about a year during the pandemic. And a lot of those barriers exist, prior to the pandemic, but having, the overlaying issues of the pandemic has really escalated that need for emergency shelter. So in our past year in 2021, we served only 218 adults and children in our emergency shelter programs, which is just about half of our average annual shelter clients. In Rhode Island, 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men have reported experiencing domestic violence across their lifetimes. So the impacts of experiencing domestic violence includes PTSD, being fearful for one's safety, injuries, missing work or school, needing legal services, medical care, or help from an advocate. I invite all of you to check out our website to learn more about our resources, the different work that the coalition participates in, learn more about the signs of domestic violence. And if you want to learn a little bit more, we have a biannual training calendar that we put on, not only for our membership, but also for our community partners. So in a bit, I'm going to drop a few of these links in the chat for you all to take a look at. So we're here about homelessness and housing for survivors in a lot of the different categories of people that we've been talking about today. So domestic violence is a leading cause of homelessness for women and their children. And the need to find safe and affordable housing is one of the most pressing and immediate concerns for survivors. Many survivors face unique barriers to accessing shelter and affordable housing due to the power and control dynamics involved in these types of relationships. These barriers are often exacerbated for those marginalized in our society and with the least access to resources, including many survivors of color, Native Americans, immigrants, those living in poverty and in geographic isolation, formerly incarcerated survivors, and survivors with disabilities. One of our more national partners, the Safe Housing Partnerships, created a great video that I'm going to show you right now on the intersectionality of homelessness and domestic violence.
Homelessness is an issue that far too many people face. People of color, specifically Black people, other persons of color, and Indigenous people, experience homelessness in a dramatically different way than their white counterparts. People who hold multiple identities, such as those who live at the intersections of disability, immigration status, sexual orientation, gender identity, and more, experience compounded barriers that further homelessness and housing instability. A recent study found that 66% of people experiencing homelessness were Black, while 28% were white. Black individuals are only 13% of the US general population, compared to 74% of those who are white. Rates of homelessness within Native communities are 3 to 8 times higher than that of the general population. In total, 78% of people experiencing homelessness identified as people of color. This overrepresentation of Indigenous, Black, and other people of color experiencing homelessness cannot be explained by poverty or identity alone. Structural racism, historical policies, institutional practices, and cultural narratives that perpetuate racial inequity put people of color at a disadvantage in obtaining safe and affordable housing. Statistically, women of color are much more likely to experience domestic and sexual violence, and survivors often face network impoverishment. Network impoverishment occurs when the addition of a financially distressed household member places an extra strain on family resources. Oftentimes, we tell a survivor experiencing homelessness to go to a relative or friend's house. However, network impoverishment can cause immense burdens on the existing limited finances and available support from that network. Racial disparities arise at every juncture, from the legal system to housing, to healthcare, to child welfare, to public benefits. Understanding the intersections between domestic and sexual violence, racism, and homelessness, and applying an equity, survivor-centered lens in our work is the only pathway to stability, safe housing, and healing for all survivors. If we want to address racial inequity, we have to acknowledge it, learn about it, and talk about it, so we can do more about it together. To learn more, visit safehousingpartnerships.org.
One of our national partners, the National Network to End Domestic Violence, conducts an annual count of adults and children who seek services from domestic violence shelter programs during a single 24-hour survey period. In the most recent Rhode Island report from 2021, we calculated 61 requests for services went unmet on this single day. Of those requests, 93% were requests for shelter and housing support. This is on track to what we've been seeing the past few years, when the overwhelmingly amount of requests that went unmet on this single day were requests for shelter and housing support. So it continues a conversation that is the most requested need identified by survivors of domestic violence. So one of the most dangerous times for a victim is when they begin to break away from their abusive partner. When a victim leaves, attempts to leave, or if the abuser suspects that the victim is preparing to leave, there's a higher risk of elevating violence and homicide. This risk is one of the many reasons why escaping abuse is often not as simple as just leaving. Each year, there are between 3 and 7 domestic violence homicides in our state, which we are very fortunate to have a very small number of domestic violence homicides, but it's still a very big issue in our state. The coalition is preparing a report analyzing domestic violence homicides in Rhode Island and providing policy recommendations to keep survivors safe. So in our most recent report that we're very close to publishing, between 2006 and 2020, 26 domestic violence homicides occurred in our state. Many of these cases involve children and custody issues, abusers having access to firearms, victims who attempted to flee, victims who are proactively looked to the courts to protect them by filing restraining orders, victims who moved away from their abusers, and victims who disclosed the abuse they experienced to family and friends. So what can you do as realtors? One of the best things for our community to help stop domestic violence is knowing the signs and consider the many barriers survivors and their children face when working the system to seek safety from the violence they're experiencing. The source of income legislation that passed last year, and what Jason was talking about just right before me, is only one step forward. Many survivors have a history of eviction or other housing issues that may be public to landlords as they search for a safe home. Some abusers may sabotage a victim's credit history by taking out multiple credit lines in their name and not paying for them. Survivors may have spotty employment histories as their abusers sabotage them by showing up to their place of employment and harassing the victim and other employees at the workplace. Abusers may also damage property in the unit that the victim lives, furthering the eviction history on that victim. So to end here, domestic violence is a leading cause of homelessness for survivors and their children. The need for safe and affordable housing is a top need for survivors in finding safety from their abusers. Lastly, today we are honoring one of our fellow Rhode Island realtors who passed away in 2002. Her name was Barbara Lombardi. So I would like everyone to take a moment of silence in the memory of Barbara, victims and survivors of domestic violence, and their families. Thank you very much. That was my time. I'm going to put a few of those links that I was talking about earlier, including the Safe Housing Partnerships video, and then I'll also leave my contact information. Thank you.
Ian, thank you so much for that really helpful and concerning information. As everyone's probably noticed, we're actually just right at 11 o'clock right now. So completely understand if any of the panelists need to leave, or any audience members need to leave. We do have a few questions that have been posted in the Q&A. And so we do have some of the panelists are willing to answer those live. For anyone who needs to go, thank you so much for joining us today. And both panelists and members of the audience, and Bev Pierce mentioned earlier, this session is being recorded. So that'll be posted in a few days, probably early next week. Okay, let's go to the questions. All right, our first question is from Monica Brown. To clarify, a landlord cannot say that they don't want college students. And Jason has offered to answer this. Jason?
That kind of preference may well run afoul of the age discrimination law. When you think about college students, there's a specific age group that they are. So while you're not necessarily saying you don't want people of this age, it kind of runs into that, well, the only people who are really college students are of 18 to 23. So that actually could be considered illegal. We've had cases where we've actually filed that under the age discrimination law.
Great, thank you. Our next question is also from Monica Brown. Can you please discuss how we as realtors can help undocumented people rent an apartment? So Anna Kano Morales, who had to leave, actually posted a suggestion in the FAQ. So let me mention that, and then we'll turn to Marcela, who would like to answer this. Anna had mentioned that the person might have a TIN number, which is used to pay taxes. So even if they don't already have other forms of ID, that might be an option. But Marcela would like to join. Marcela Bettencourt would like to join in here. Marcela?
Thank you. And thank you, Monica Brown, for asking that question. So I think it's a really interesting and complex issue. Like Ana said, Ana Kano Morales mentioned, undocumented people actually can pay taxes, and they're able to pay their income taxes with a number called an ITIN number. I cannot remember from the top of my head what it stands for. So if anyone else in the chat wants to put it, that'd be great. And so I think that is one way in which if you're an undocumented tenant or a mixed status family, which means one of the individuals in the family may be undocumented while others aren't, in order to prove, income and things of that sort. I think as a realtor, when talking to the landlord, I think that's an important conversation. I know that there's issues of, well, can this family pay? Can this person pay? If they're able to prove, to show to you that, they pay taxes and this money is coming in, I think that's an incredible way for all of you to advocate for this. And this issue sadly also goes beyond that. So one of the other recommendations that we would have, thank you, Beverly, it's an ITIN is individual taxpayer identification number. Thank you. And so this goes even broader. So there's actually legislation right now with the General Assembly so that landlords can't discriminate on the basis of immigration status, because, and for example, I'm a renter. And so I'm actually looking for apartments, and I've seen that even though it's right now against the law to say you're not taking Section 8 vouchers, it's still posted. And sometimes it talks about status, or they'll ask in person. And so it's incredibly difficult for our communities, our undocumented communities or mixed status communities to be able to access housing. So if you can, like as realtors, you have such a strong advocacy piece in this. One of the other things that I would recommend is to connect with two organizations that do a lot of work around immigrant issues. One of them is Direct Action for Rights and Equality, or DARE, and another one is called Amor, which is translates to love. I'll put them in the chat. I also would recommend talking to an immigration attorney about what other protections and help you can provide to undocumented or mixed status families. So like I said, I'll put all this in the chat. But thank you, Monica Brown, for asking that question.
Sure. And then also Ian, and thank you, Marcela. Ian actually had also posted another suggestion in the chat, which is the Rhode Island Center for Justice. And I don't know about the rest of you, there's so much great information that's been posted in the chat. I'm trying to go like, which one do I copy first? So I think what I would propose to our communications department, put them on the spot here, but I think what we'll do is we'll package these links and we'll put them in social media and include them in our newsletter too, because there's just so much information from our panelists. Okay,
Yes,
and then
Monica, we'll create a document and we'll put the recording and the handout in our e-learning platform so everyone can get it from there too. And we'll do it social and everything else too.
Even better. Thank you, Bev, for offering. Okay, and our final question that is in the Q&A is from Susan Perry. In order to accept Section 8 vouchers, does the landlord/owner have to be approved through Rhode Island Housing? And Jason Flanders has volunteered to answer this question. Jason.
Okay, so Section 8 vouchers are not handled by Rhode Island Housing. They're actually handled by the individual towns and cities that have the housing authorities, like Providence Housing Authority, Pawtucket Housing Authority, what have you. They're the ones who actually handle the vouchers through HUD. So there's an inspection process. There is a little bit of a process for them to apply to it. And there are annual inspections, but it's not Rhode Island Housing that handles it. I want to go back to the last thing about illegal immigrants or undocumented, sorry. They may fall under our law under national origin. Immigration status isn't necessarily a protected category in and of itself, but it kind of falls under that whole adverse impact thing again, where when you think about undocumented individuals, what nationality are they generally? So while you may not be able to file a charge of discrimination based on immigration status, it may still fall under the national origin provision of our law. So you could probably contact us for that as well, and we can see if there's something that we can do.
Yeah, thanks. And just to add one quick thing, I know when Susan mentioned and Jason mentioned Rhode Island housing, you're right, it's through the housing authority that you get the approvals. But there are some towns and cities where Rhode Island housing has a contract, a services agreement. So they actually act as the housing authority to approve that. So Susan, I don't know if that's what you were thinking of, but that's about, I believe that's about a third of the state, but don't hold me to that number. But in some cases, the town or city would refer the landlord or property manager to Rhode Island housing. And I'd just like to ask everyone, panelists, before everyone scatters, would everyone like to show your video so everyone can just kind of give you a virtual round of applause? See your smiling faces if you're there. So, okay, I'm going to start. Oh, Susan is a black square. Susan Martin Phipps. I'm going to give everyone a round of applause. And I know you're doing that at home right now. This is just wonderful, wonderful information, and we just appreciate everyone's time so much. So watch for the document that Bev's going to put together. But I hope that we can all continue to work together to make discrimination a thing of the past and focus on inclusion. Susan, before we go, Martin's Phipps, would you like to mention anything about the committee that you chair for the Realtor Association?
Oh, I did put my information down there. We have been meeting for about 10 months to 12 months. We meet every month. We are dealing with education, with trying to get more people into the industry, not only just into the industry, but putting them into positions of leadership, looking to see what we can do to help. So please, anyone that's on as a participant or a panelist, we would love to hear from you. We'd love to have you sit in on the committee if that's something you'd like to do, but we are there to see if we can help out. Again, let's end discrimination. Let's start to put a dent into this. Thank you.
But on that note, we hope everyone has a great, great day. And thank you all so much for your time, panelists, and Anna, who had to leave. So, okay, that's it. Thank you, everybody.